The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours, and Jasper Caulfield realized he was going to die. His woodpile, the same woodpile he had proudly declared sufficient for any Nebraska winter, was buried under 6 feet of snow. His stove had gone cold an hour ago. His children were huddled under every blanket in the house, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. And somewhere across town, in a direction he had forbidden his family to look, smoke rose from Patience Vardell's chimney. It had been rising for 3 days now. 3 days of the worst blizzard anyone in Sutter's Hollow could remember, and the widow's fire had never gone out. Her woodpile, the woodpile that everyone in town had mocked for 3 years, was still standing, still stacked, still feeding the fire that was keeping her alive while everyone else ran out of fuel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why Jasper Caulfield was freezing in his own home, while a widow he had publicly ridiculed stayed warm, you have to understand what Patience Vardell had learned in Minnesota before she ever came to Nebraska, and why she spent 3 years stacking wood while the whole town laughed. Patience was born in 1844 in the Lake Country of Minnesota, where her father ran a logging camp and her mother kept the camp kitchen. She grew up among men who understood winter, who knew that the cold could kill you faster than any predator, who stockpiled firewood the way other people stockpiled gold. Her father taught her to read the weather, to see the signs that most people missed, to prepare for the worst, even when the worst seemed impossible. Winter doesn't care how strong you are, her father told her. Winter doesn't care how smart you are or how much money you have. Winter only cares whether you have enough wood to keep the fire burning. Stack more than you need. Then stack more than that. The blizzard that kills you is the one you didn't prepare for. She married young, a logger named Thomas Vardell, who shared her father's understanding of cold weather. They moved to Nebraska in 1870, chasing the promise of cheap land and a fresh start. Thomas built them a cabin on the edge of Sutter's Hollow, and the first thing he did, before he plowed a field, before he bought cattle, before he did anything else, was start cutting firewood. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Thomas died in the winter of 1884, thrown from his horse during a supply run to town. He left Patience alone with a cabin, 40 acres of unplowed land, and a woodpile that was already larger than any other in Sutter's Hollow. Most widows would have sold the property and moved to town. Most widows would have found a new husband or returned to family in Minnesota. But Patience had been raised by a logger. She knew what mattered. She kept cutting wood. Every day, from spring through fall, she hitched her horse Clementine to the wagon and drove to the creek bottom where the cottonwoods grew thick. She felled trees with the same axe her husband had used, split logs with the same maul, hauled loads back to her cabin where the woodpile grew higher and longer with each passing week. By the end of 1885, she had enough wood for 2 winters. By the end of 1886, she had enough for 3. By the end of 1887, the woodpile stretched 40 feet along the side of her cabin, stacked 8 feet high, covered with a roof of salvaged lumber that kept the rain and snow off the seasoned logs beneath. The townspeople thought she had lost her mind. A woman alone, spending every day cutting wood she couldn't possibly need, building a pile so large it was visible from the main road into town. They rode past her property and shook their heads. They gathered at the mercantile and speculated about her sanity. They wondered if grief had broken her mind, if the loneliness had driven her to obsession, if someone should intervene before she hurt herself. The work itself was remarkable and remarkably visible. Every day, patients would hitch Clementine to the wagon and drive to the creek bottom where the cottonwoods grew. She would fell a tree with her husband's axe, limb it with his hatchet, buck it into rounds with his saw. Then she would split the rounds into firewood, load the wagon, and haul it back to the cabin. One load in the morning, one load in the afternoon, sometimes 3 loads on the long summer days when the light lasted until 9 o'clock. The neighbors watched her work. They watched a woman doing labor that most men found exhausting, doing it alone, doing it every single day. Some of them offered to buy her wood. She clearly had more than she needed. Some of them offered to help. A woman shouldn't have to work so hard. Some of them offered to find her a new husband. Surely she would stop this madness if she had a man to provide for her. Patience refused them all. She kept cutting. She kept stacking. She kept building towards something that none of them could see. And Alderman Jasper Caulfield, the wealthiest man in Sutter's Hollow, the man who set the tone for respectable opinion, declared her a cautionary tale about what happened to women without proper male guidance. "The Vardell widow has gone wood mad," Caulfield announced at the town council meeting in September of 1887. "She's got enough firewood stacked to heat the territorial capital, and she's still cutting more. Someone should check on her, make sure she's not a danger to herself." "Maybe she's planning to sell it," suggested one of the other aldermen. "To whom?" Caulfield laughed. "Everyone in this town has their own woodlot. Everyone cuts their own wood. The only market for firewood is people too lazy or too old to cut their own, and there aren't enough of those to need a pile that size. No, gentlemen, the widow has simply lost her reason. It happens to women without guidance. It's a tragedy, but not unexpected. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It helps more than you know." The laughter that followed Caulfield's pronouncement spread through Sutter's Hollow like wildfire. The children made up songs about the wood-mad widow. They sang them on the way to school, sang them in the schoolyard, sang them loud enough for Patience to hear when she drove her wagon past on her way to the creek bottom. The women clucked their tongues at quilting circles and sewing bees, thanking God their husbands were still alive to prevent such foolishness. The men calculated how much money Patience had wasted on a woodpile she would never use, wood that would rot before she could burn it, labor that could have been spent on something productive. Some of the crueler townspeople rode out to her property specifically to mock her. They would sit on their horses and watch her work, calling out suggestions and insults. "Why don't you stack it to the moon, widow? That way you could warm the stars." My grandmother had a touch of the madness too. They had to put her in a home eventually. Perhaps we should make arrangements for you. Patience heard the mockery, but she didn't respond. She had been raised by a logger who understood winter. She knew things that the people of Sutter's Hollow, people who had never seen a Minnesota blizzard, people who thought Nebraska cold was as bad as cold could get, simply couldn't understand. Her father had told her about the winter of 1856, when the snow fell for 3 weeks straight and the drifts buried cabins to their roof lines. He had told her about families who ran out of wood and burned their furniture, then their floors, then froze to death anyway when there was nothing left to burn. She kept cutting. She kept stacking. She kept preparing for the storm that she knew would come. The storm came on January 12th, 1888. It started as a warm day, unseasonably warm for January, warm enough that children went to school without coats and farmers worked in the fields in their shirt sleeves. The sky was clear. The sun was shining. Everyone in Sutter's Hollow agreed it was the finest January day they could remember. Then the sky turned black. The cold front came down from Canada like a wall of ice, dropping temperatures from 40 degrees above zero to 20 degrees below in less than 3 hours. The wind rose to 60 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that people couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The warm day became a killing field. Children walking home from school got lost between the schoolhouse and their farms, wandering in circles until they collapsed. Farmers who had been working in the fields stumbled toward homes they couldn't find, the snow filling their eyes and mouths and lungs. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind and snow and cold so intense that cattle froze standing up, that water froze in pitchers inches from hot stoves, that people burned every stick of furniture they owned just trying to stay alive until the storm passed. Jasper Caulfield's woodpile ran out on the 2nd day. He had always kept what he considered a reasonable supply. 2 cords, maybe 3, enough for a normal winter if he was careful. But this wasn't a normal winter. This was the kind of cold that consumed wood like a starving man consumed food. His stove needed feeding every hour just to keep the temperature above freezing. His 2 cords became 1 cord, then half a cord, then a pile of kindling that wouldn't last the night. He burned his chairs first, then his table, then the bed frames and the shelving, and the wooden chest his grandmother had brought from Virginia. He burned everything in his house that would burn, and still the cold crept in, and still the storm howled outside, and still the smoke rose from Patience Vardal's chimney while his own went cold. His wife was the one who finally said it. "We have to go to her." "I won't," Caulfield said. "I won't beg that woman for anything." "Then we'll die," his wife said, "and the children will die. Is your pride worth more than their lives?" It wasn't. Nothing was worth more than his children's lives. So Jasper Caulfield, the alderman of Sutter's Hollow, the man who had publicly mocked the wood-mad widow for 3 years, wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned and staggered out into the blizzard. The walk to Patience's cabin was less than half a mile, but it took him nearly an hour. The wind knocked him down 3 times. The cold bit through his clothes like they weren't there. He lost feeling in his hands and feet before he was halfway there. He navigated by the smoke from her chimney, the only landmark visible in the white chaos of the storm. He wasn't the first to arrive. By the time Caulfield stumbled through Patience's door, there were already a dozen people huddled around her stove. Families who had run out of wood, farmers who had been caught in the fields, children who had lost their way between school and home. The cabin was crowded and warm, the stove crackling with seasoned cottonwood, the woodpile outside still tall enough to last another month. Patience looked at Caulfield for a long moment. She saw the frost on his eyebrows, the fear in his eyes, the pride that was finally broken by necessity. She remembered every joke he had told at her expense, every time he had called her wood-mad, every smirk on his face when he rode past her property. Then she stepped aside and let him in. "There's room by the stove," she said. "Warm yourself. I'll put on some coffee." More people came as the blizzard continued. The Hendricks family arrived an hour after Caulfield, their children crying with cold, their father carrying the youngest who had stopped shivering, a bad sign that Patience recognized from her father's stories. The Muellers came next, then the Johnsons, then families whose names Patience barely knew, all of them drawn by the smoke from her chimney, the only beacon visible in the endless white. 20 people by nightfall of the first day, 30 by morning of the second, 40 souls crammed into a cabin built for two by the time the blizzard finally began to weaken on the third day. They slept on the floor, on the chairs, standing up against the walls when there was no room to lie down. They shared body heat and blankets and the endless supply of firewood that Patience had spent 3 years stacking. She fed them from her stores, salted meat and canned vegetables and dried fruit she had put up the previous fall. She had prepared for this too, though she hadn't known it at the time. She had simply done what her mother had taught her. Preserve everything, waste nothing. Always have more than you need, because someday you might need more than you have. She warmed them with wood she had cut herself, log by log, day by day, while they laughed at her. Every few hours, she would bundle up and fight her way to the woodpile, brushing off snow to reach the seasoned logs beneath, carrying armloads back to feed the stove that was keeping 40 people alive. The wood burned clean and hot, properly seasoned cottonwood that she had cut 2 years ago and let dry under the roof she had built to protect it. The stove never went cold. The cabin never dropped below 50 degrees. And outside, the blizzard howled and raged and killed everyone who hadn't found shelter. Thank you for watching this story about Patience Vardell and Sutter's Hollow. If it meant something to you, hit subscribe and the bell icon so you never miss when we release a new story. The blizzard broke on the third day. The wind died. The snow stopped. The sun came out on a transformed world, drifts 20 feet high, livestock frozen in the fields, houses buried to their roof lines. The survivors emerged from Patience's cabin, blinking in the sudden brightness, struggling to comprehend what they had lived through and what they had lost. The Hendricks boy was the first to see his family's farm, or what remained of it. The house was still standing, but the barn had collapsed under the weight of snow. The cattle were gone, scattered or frozen, impossible to know which until the snow melted in spring. Everything his father had spent 20 years building, destroyed in 3 days. More than 200 people died in the Great Blizzard of 1888 across Nebraska and the Dakota Territories. Children froze walking home from school, some of them found in spring, still clutching their lunch pails. Just yards from safety, they couldn't see through the snow. Farmers froze in fields they had worked that very morning, caught by the sudden change in weather, unable to find their way home through the whiteout. Families froze in houses that ran out of wood, huddled together for warmth that never came, found in spring still holding each other. But in Sutter's Hollow, everyone who made it to Patience Vardell's cabin survived. 40 people, 12 families. Children who would grow up to have children of their own. Grandchildren who would hear the story of the widow who saved them. Jasper Caulfield was the last to leave. He stood in her doorway, his family already walking toward what remained of their home, and tried to find words for what he needed to say. His wife carried their youngest, who had recovered from the cold thanks to Patience's quick action with warm blankets and warmed stones wrapped in cloth. His older children walked ahead, looking back at the cabin that had saved their lives. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I owe you more than an apology. I called you mad. I made you a joke. I led this town in laughing at you, and you saved my children's lives anyway." "You didn't know," Patience said. "I should have known. You tried to tell us, not in words, but in every log you stacked. You tried to show us what we needed to do, and we laughed instead of learning. I was the loudest voice against you. I organized the mockery. I set the tone that made it acceptable to ridicule a widow for working harder than anyone else in this town. And when my family was freezing, you took us in anyway. Patience was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father taught me that winter doesn't care about pride. It only cares whether you have enough wood. I didn't stack that pile to prove anyone wrong, Alderman. I stacked it because I knew the storm would come, and I wanted to be ready when it did." "How did you know?" Caulfield asked. "How did you know it would be this bad?" "I didn't know it would be this storm," Patience said. "I just knew there would be a storm someday, bad enough to kill everyone who wasn't ready. My father saw storms like that in Minnesota. He told me about the winter of 1856, when the snow buried cabins and families ran out of wood and froze in their own homes. He taught me that you don't prepare for the winter you expect. You prepare for the winter that might come, the one that's worse than anything you've seen before, the one that kills everyone who thought they knew how bad it could get." Caulfield nodded slowly. "I'll remember that. I'll make sure my children remember it too." "See that you do," Patience said. "The next storm is already coming. It might be 10 years from now. It might be 50, but it's coming, and the only question is whether you'll be ready when it arrives." The town of Sutter's Hollow changed after the blizzard. Woodpiles grew taller all across the county. Not as tall as Patience's, perhaps, but taller than they had been before. People who had kept 2 cords now kept 5. People who had kept 5 now kept 10. People who had mocked Patience Vardell now asked her advice, rode out to her cabin to learn how to read the weather, how to stack wood so it would season properly, how to prepare for the winter that might kill them. The phrase entered the vocabulary of Nebraska and eventually the vocabulary of the whole frontier. Stack like the widow became shorthand for preparing beyond what seemed reasonable, for building reserves that others called excessive, for remembering that the emergency you prepare for is never as bad as the emergency that actually comes. When new settlers arrived and asked the old-timers for advice, the answer was always the same: stack like the widow. Jasper Caulfield never mocked anyone again. He became Patience's most vocal defender, correcting anyone who spoke ill of her, telling the story of the blizzard to every newcomer who would listen. He served 2 more terms as alderman, and his first act each fall was to ride through town and check everyone's woodpile, making sure no one was caught short when winter came. Patience lived another 30 years, tending her woodpile until she was too old to swing an axe, then teaching her grandchildren to do it for her. She married again in 1892, a widower named Silas Henshaw, who understood why she kept stacking wood and helped her do it. They had no children together, but they raised his 3 and taught them all the lessons her father had taught her. She died in 1918, warm beside a fire fed by wood her grandson had stacked, surrounded by family who understood what she had always understood, that winter was coming, always coming, and the only question was whether you would be ready when it arrived. Her cabin is gone now, but the spot where her woodpile stood is marked with a stone. The inscription reads, "Here stood the woodpile that saved Sutter's Hollow, January 12th to 15th, 1888. Tourists sometimes stop to take pictures. Locals sometimes bring their children to tell the story of the widow who stacked wood while the town laughed, who burned that wood while the town froze, who taught Nebraska what it meant to prepare for the worst. The worst always comes, sooner or later. The only question is whether you'll have enough wood when it does. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier wisdom and the quiet vindication of those who knew better all along.